Okay, between 1791 and 1819, 9 Western states joined the Union from the original 13. So people were definitely marching west, moving out into that territory. And they were able to purchase land because of the land ordinance of 1785. And there began to be a pattern. And the pattern was, for every slave state, there was going to be a free state, or vice versa. For every free state, there was going to be a slave state. And Southerners wanted to make sure that they kept that equal balance. That's an important concept to understand, is the reason why Southerners needed to, as they felt, maintain equality in the number of slave states compared to the number of free states. And it all had to do politically with the Senate. Here's the worst case scenario for Southern states, is that a bill would pass the House and the Senate, and the president would sign it, and the bill would outlaw slavery. And if that were the case, there was nothing that the Southern states felt like they could do about that. Their solution to it was to always maintain at least equality in the Senate. If there were an equal number of slave states as free states, that would mean an equal number of senators from the slave states as there were senators from the free states. For instance, if there were, like in this case, 11 and 11, 11 free states and 11 slave states, that would mean 22 senators from the free states, because there's 2 senators per state, and 22 for the slave states. And if a bill would pass the House, because it would easily pass the House, because there's way more representatives from the North, because the population is higher than there are representatives from the South. So if a bill passed the House that would outlaw slavery, it would get to the Senate, and the vote count would be 22 to 22. And it would be no, you would not be able to get a majority in the Senate. So never will Northerners be able to pass a bill that would outlaw slavery, as long as they maintain that balance. Once the balance got off by even one state, then Southerners feared that slavery would be eliminated with a bill that would pass the House and now pass the Senate, and the president would sign it. So that became their driving force, Southerners' driving force. Now, why were people moving into, say, the Ohio area in large numbers? Well, it was because of geography. There was a natural break in the mountains, a pass known as the Cumberland Road. There's a road that went right through the Appalachians, and it was easy. Wouldn't say easy, but moving out west wasn't as difficult as it was if you were to go in different areas. So people would leave Virginia, and then they'd go into Ohio. That was the natural area. And eventually they're going to extend this road. So here's the area that we're talking about here. It's a circle. This is the Louisiana Purchase Territory. We'll be discussing that. But here's when things get a little bit contentious, is that Missouri wanted to become a state. And this is right after the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase went through in 1801. And the first territory in circle here, Louisiana Purchase Territory, the first territory to become a state was right down here, and it was Louisiana. And the reason Louisiana was so ready to become a state is because they had a large population. So because the people were down here in New Orleans, and they were ready. So it's naturally in the South, so it became a slave state. The next territory that had enough people to be able to ask for statehood was the Missouri Territory right here. You could see here the Mississippi River, the Missouri River. That's where Lewis and Clark left. They left from there. And so they had enough people there, because of the bustling trade that went on, for Missouri to ask for statehood. So the thing about Missouri, though, it's right on the border between being able to grow cotton and not being able to grow cotton. About this much of the state, if you could see where my cursor is, just below the Missouri, the word Missouri, they were able to grow cotton in the southern part of it, and they supported slavery. The rest of Missouri up here, it was, you couldn't, the weather was cold, too cold, the climate wasn't right for them to grow cotton. So they didn't want to become a slave state. Southerners, of course, wanted Missouri to become a slave state because they wanted to have an equal number. They needed one more. They have one, the same or one more slave state. So the balance would be off if Missouri comes in, because at the time there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. So they had to come up with a compromise, and here's the compromise. And it was Henry Clay, the guy that we've been talking about as the Speaker of the House. He's from Kentucky, pro-slavery guy. In 1820, he came up with the what is known as the Compromise of 1820, but it's better known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state. Maine, which was originally part of Massachusetts, was to become its own state, and it would be a free state, thus maintaining the balance between the free and slave states. The other thing that they did here is they took and they drew an imaginary line right here. Here's an imaginary line at 36 degrees 30 north latitude on the map, and said, in the future, any territory coming in above the line was to be free territory. Any territory coming in below, which really is only the Arkansas territory, would be slave. It would be slave. So yeah, so if you see this map, here's Maine and here's Missouri. Maine free, Missouri slave, line drawn at 36 degrees 30. And for the first time in history, the North appeased the South. There's a word that I'm going to use a lot. To appease somebody is to give in to them. Southerners wanted to maintain slavery. Instead of saying, drawing a line, well, technically they did draw a line, but that's not what I mean. Instead of drawing a line in the sand and saying, look, we are no longer going to allow slavery. They didn't. They allowed slavery to continue. Had they drawn that line in the sand, though, it in all likelihood would have meant Civil War started in 1820. It could have meant that. It could have meant dissolving the Union. Who knows what it could have meant? I mean, that's all speculation. But Civil War was put off. It could have happened in 1820. It allowed the North to get stronger and the South to get weaker, and all that stuff that we'll talk about in class. But really, Henry Clay came to the rescue and saved the Union from being dissolved in possible civil war with the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. So appeasement of the South. They're going to do it. The North is going to do it quite a bit before they can no longer appease the South. And war starts in 1861, Civil War. All right, I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States for 34 years. I'll reiterate, as I said earlier, that he allowed the Federalist Party legacy to continue, even though the Federalist Party was dead. They were dead. They no longer had any power. Their inability to relate to the common man. The death of Hamilton meant the death of the party. But however, as I've said, this guy was in there for 34 years, and he shaped the court. And by doing that, he shaped the direction of the country, that we would always have a strong federal government and weaker states. The federal government would have more power. He did this with numerous court cases that he presided over. And one of them we've already talked about, and that was Marbury versus Madison, that established judicial review, that the Supreme Court has a final say on the constitutionality of a law. McCulloch versus Maryland was a court case in 1819 where Maryland didn't like the national bank, Maryland, southern state, pro states' rights. Maryland didn't like the national bank, and they were going to tax the bank, the national bank, which had a branch in Maryland. They were going to tax it out of existence. They made basically an agreement that said we're going to tax it, and then we're going to tax it some more, and we're going to keep taxing it until the bank goes out of business. Well, there was, of course, lawsuits, and it got all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court under John Marshall said, no way, no how. We're not going to allow the federal government, a state to tax a federal entity. And he uttered the phrase that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. That a state could essentially destroy any kind of national, whether it be a bank or a national park or something like that. So it's still on the books today as precedence that states can't tax the federal, like a bank or a federal authority like that. Another, Cohens versus Virginia. United States Supreme Court decision, most noted for the Marshall Court's assertion of the power to review state Supreme Court decisions in criminal law matters. So if a state court decides something in a criminal matter, the Supreme Court could overturn that. Cohens versus Virginia is based on lottery tickets in sale of lottery tickets in Virginia. Gibbons versus Ogden. The Supreme Court defined Congress's constitutional power to regulate interstate commerce. This is specified in the Constitution that the matters dealing with interstate commerce, that Congress deals with them and not the states. But it was crystallized here in Gibbons versus Ogden. That's big. It very similar to Marbury versus Madison, which crystallized judicial review. It was previously stated in the Constitution, but it had been violated. Fletcher versus Peck, land fraud case asserted the right of the Supreme Court to validate state laws conflicting with the Constitution. If a state passes a law that conflicts with the Constitution, that the Supreme Court could come in and flip that decision. And Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819 also. The Supreme Court established substantial protection for the charters of institutions and businesses. Dartmouth College was established according to a charter written by the colonial governor of New Hampshire and granted by King George III in 1796. In short, New Hampshire tried to take this charter away and make it public, and the Supreme Court said that states cannot interfere with a charter. Once again, more power to the federal government, less power to the states. Okay, again, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the Treaty of 1818 that happened during this time. It was a treaty between the United States and Great Britain over boundaries. Here's basically what they decided. You could see in this dealt with the area. Part of it was dealing with the area that was north of the Louisiana Purchase Territory and what was a British possession, British Canadian possession, what was an American possession. It called for the joint occupation of this area over here, the Oregon country. The United States and Great Britain were both hunting and trading for fur there, so they said, we're jointly going to control this area. The northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, as I said earlier, was set at this 49th parallel right here. So there was some discussion about where the border is. They established the 49th parallel as that line. And then fishing rights, U.S. fishermen were granted rights to fish off Newfoundland and Labrador right over here, where some of the best fishing in the world. Also, during this time, the United States purchased Florida, repurchased it again from the Spanish. Basically, they took it by force. Andrew Jackson, future President Andrew Jackson, the same Andrew Jackson that was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was commissioned by President James Monroe to attack and punish the Spanish in Florida for raids in the South. They were going into Georgia and they were attacking Americans. Basically, bottom line, this is kind of the way Jackson was. He was maybe a little Trumpish. He swept across the border of Florida and hanged 2 Indian chiefs without ceremony, without trial, executed 2 British subjects for assisting the Indians, and proceeded to seize a number of different settlements in Spanish Florida. He almost single-handedly got us involved in a war against the British, the Spanish, and various Indian tribes. He just wreaked havoc in Florida. And later on, he was censured for that, basically a slap on the wrist, told you shouldn't have done that. But in the end, Spain realized that they couldn't hold Florida any longer. It was fruitless for them to try. And in 1819, we had a treaty called the Transcontinental Treaty, and the United States purchased the rights to Florida from Spain. And there were some land claims that were exchanged, but bottom line is Florida became part of the United States permanently. So it changed hands a number of times, but finally it's permanently part of the United States. All right, let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine, the United States international policy when it came to foreign countries intervening in the Americas. And I'm not just talking about North America where the United States is, I'm talking about Central America and South America. Little background, little contextualization here. In the early 1800s to early to mid 1800s, many of the South American countries and Central American countries were breaking away from Spain. They were all colonies of Spain for the most part. Almost all of them, if not most, were Spanish colonies, including Mexico and a lot of the South and Central American countries. And one by one, they were breaking away from Spain. Spain was no longer powerful, and these countries wanted their freedom and independence. And of course, they used the United States' revolution as inspiration for them to go and get their freedom and independence. Well, Great Britain approached the United States with a plan. Great Britain, in their mind, they wanted to trade with all these South and Central American countries. They were potential trade partners for them. So it's a money-making venture for them. The last thing Great Britain wanted was for Germany or France or any other European country to go in and take those vulnerable South and Central American countries now that are not aligned with Spain. So they didn't want them to be able to do that. So they approached the United States and said, look, why don't we come together and with a joint declaration to the world that those countries are off limits to anybody taking them over. And the United States, feeling pretty good about themselves at this time, post War of 1812, having just beaten the British, said, you know what, we'll do it ourselves. We'll be the ones to do that. We don't need you. We're no longer indebted to you. We no longer rely on you. We are a growing international power, and we'll make this statement, this international declaration. So Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, and President Monroe got together and they came up with this Monroe Doctrine, it's called. And it's a warning to European countries to stay the heck out of the Americas. On the other hand, the United States agreed not to interfere in European affairs. It basically said that the United States would look upon it as an act of war if any European country meddled in the Americas, which included North America, Central America, and South America. It was a very bold statement, and seen as though after the War of 1812, our military pretty much shut it down. We didn't have much of a military. If any one of those countries tried to challenge us and take one of those territories, in all likelihood, we wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. But as it was, none of the European countries did challenge us. We also knew this, that if any European country did challenge us and we really needed the British to come and help, we knew that financially they were invested, so to speak, and they would come and help us. But we didn't say that. We kind of, flexed our muscles and posed a little bit and said, don't mess with us. We just defeated the biggest, strongest country in the world in the War of 1812. Not really, we tied, but that was a win for us. It was an expression of post-World War War of 1812 U.S. nationalism and patriotism, and the illusion of isolationism. We are going to be isolated. We're here, you're there, stay the hell out of our business. And that foreshadows how we're going to do things later on. So, yeah. It says here, responding to the Russian territorial claims along the northern Pacific coast and concerned with European nations would attempt to seize recently independent Latin American states, President James Monroe announced a new national policy. No new colonies would be allowed in the Americas, and European powers were not to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. This mural depicts a discussion among the President and members of the cabinet. From left to right are President James Monroe, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Attorney General William Wirt, and Secretary of War John Calhoun, and Secretary of the Navy Samuel Southard. So yeah, Monroe Doctrine, statement of American boldness, right? We're trying to become a world power at this point. We're a long way away from becoming a world power, but you could look back and say, might have been the first time that we really were declaring that we were a world power. A little bit premature, but